Welcome to the April edition of the Cinetopia Radio Show and Podcast. I'm Amanda from Cinetopia, and I'm here today with our co-producer, Jim Ross. Today on the show, we're going to be reviewing 3 films that will be coming to a cinema near you. RENFIELD, directed by Chris McKay and stars Nicolas Cage. One Fine Morning, directed by Mia Hansen-Love, starring Léa Seydoux. And RODEO by first-time director Lola Couveron. We'll also be talking about the Local Hero 40th Anniversary, a film by Bill Forsyth that Cinetopia is doing events up in Aberdeenshire. And we'll be talking a little bit about the Save Filmhouse campaign, as we always do. So please stay tuned. So Jim, it's back. Jim, it's been a couple months. How have you been?
I have been enduring a constant stream of nursery-induced illnesses, thanks to my young daughter. But overall fine, and she seems to have been pretty chipper throughout the whole thing, so that's fine. Yeah, so not too bad, not a lot. I haven't had a lot of time for getting to the cinema, if I'm being perfectly honest, but I have managed bits and pieces here, and I've made a concerted effort to watch what's coming out this month, so we can talk about it on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And you made a big move then from Edinburgh to Oxford, correct?
Yeah, so I'm in Oxford right now until about June, July sort of time, and then we'll be moving to somewhere in the London commuter belt, basically. Unfortunately, I probably shouldn't be saying this on an Edinburgh local radio show, I suppose, but no, I've basically permanently left Edinburgh at this point. I'll be back a couple of times to tie up some loose ends, but yeah, that's me.
Well, we're sad to, but we'll see you in London as well, and you'll at least have more cinemas there because we're without, well, I guess not, without independent cinemas, and you'll explore the great deal of stuff in London, which is exciting.
And I'm planning to try and do. I did London Film Festival in person 2021, so I'm planning to do that again this year, I think, and try and go to a few more of the things down here in person where I can. But I'll be back up in Edinburgh. I would quite like to get back up for the sort of the slightly truncated 2023 Edinburgh Film Festival if I can manage it and that sort of thing. But we'll see how we go.
Yeah, and I'm sure there'll be great news about that coming up soon. They are accepting submissions this year, but only Scottish, and it feels like it's going to be in about a week that they're closing. It was a really quick window of submissions opening, but it's exciting to at least see that they're going forward with running submissions as well. Only Scottish films though, which is interesting and good at the same time. I think that's a good move.
Yeah, I think I saw that. I think I'm broadly in favor of that, especially for this is going to be a smaller, I think, hastily arranged version as well, right? I think that's probably why that submissions window is probably so short. So I think I'm probably in favor of that because it's important to maintain these things for the Scottish arts scene. So I think having it open to Scottish films is probably the way to go for this version, at least.
And, from, again, stuff I don't know the ins and outs, but I know that there was a great effort from both the Edinburgh International Festival to kind of take the Edinburgh International Film Festival under its wing, but also largely Screen Scotland, who kind of came in and, it is one of the longest continuously running film festivals. And, it's such an important part of the city's legacy and history. So it's great that, even if it's a smaller version this year, that we, that the legacy continues, and that ideally, I think in the future it will grow. But it was an urgent action that was successful, and that's probably the most successful thing that's happened so far with the Filmhouse.
I think what you say about keeping the legacy going is important, right? Because it's also about, even if it's a smaller version than in previous years, and you can have debates about whether maybe other versions were too large to be sustainable, but that's a different discussion for a different day. But it's about maintaining its place in the sort of the cultural mindset of the city, right? It's you don't want to go a year or more without this happening, and everything not that it could really do anything about it. It had already taken a hit by having to kind of not hold a 2020 edition, really, because of COVID. So I think it's important that it keeps going. Basically, it keeps going, it keeps its place, and then that's how you kind of keep it alive, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And this weekend was the Save Filmhouse on World Arts Day, a protest for the arts as well. And quite a lot of people came to that. Not any, counselors or government officials, unfortunately. Last time there was a Save the Filmhouse protest, they had said that mostly they hadn't heard of it or hadn't been aware of it, but they were aware of it. So that's quite disappointing. The whole saga with the film house has really not changed in the last couple of months. Like there's just no news, which is like nothing to report on. It's just kind of, it's sad because we just don't know what's going on behind closed doors. And it's just, I fear that it's going to become one of those things where it just keeps going on and on, for years, and nothing, that building just sits and like decays.
Yeah, I think so. And look, I may have left Edinburgh, but I mean, Edinburgh, I've spent most of my adult life living in Edinburgh to date. And the film house sounds very sad to say, was still, very dear to me in terms of a place where I found and discovered different types of films. And I think the situation with that at the moment is kind of in stark contrast to what we've just discussed with Edinburgh Film Festival, where there is an enduring presence, albeit it maybe will be scaled back for a while. And it just feels like on the kind of like the official side of things, I'm thinking about local politics. I'm actually mainly thinking about local politicians here. I mean, you can talk about, your Angus Robertsons and your national politicians a little bit, and maybe being a bit disappointed in their response, but I'm particularly disappointed in Edinburgh City Council's response, actually. I mean, just like, we're talking about the cultural fabric of your city here. Like, if you don't want that part of town to just be, chain coffee shops, chain bars, and, restaurants, and then just public spaces that you take over once a year during August for the festival, then, you kind of got to pull your finger out and at least shout about it. So no, I'm with you. Even from afar, I find it a little bit disappointing, the response there. But I mean, I think you and the other folk in Edinburgh who have done a lot of great work under the Film House banner, you just need to keep banging the drum, and hopefully somebody starts paying attention at some point.
Well, yeah, I mean, I found it almost shocking that a pub would create a cinema themed pub in the film house, and that was the first bidder. That was the one who, I mean, they ended up not releasing it, but it's Signature Group who decided that they were going to run a cinema themed pub, as if we
which as far as I'm concerned is kind of grotesque as far as I'm concerned, really, in this context. Like I can see how, not to be too much of a dick about it, I can see how somebody with an MBA sitting in that company would sit down and think that's a cute idea, but I look at it as a actual person who wants a cinema to continue and then go, oh, piss off.
Yeah, but also given that the Cayley Picture House is across the street with the same, Yeah,
exactly. It's got exactly the same deal, and I think a similar thing was proposed for an old cinema on like Nicholson Street or something, somewhere on the south side. That kind of old disused cinema. I think a similar thing was mooted for that. It's like, how about you just give us a cinema, folks, right? Rather than,
with a bar.
If you want, you can attach a pub to it. Fine,
yeah.
Like attach a bar to it. Go wild, but like, can we have an actual screen?
It's shocking. And as someone who runs screenings and wants to continue to run screenings in this city, there's really not places that are equipped that aren't an absolute fortune to run cinema right now. And that, I think, it's just a travesty in a city like Edinburgh. So we'll leave it at that. We won't know any more news, but we'll keep reporting on it as much as possible. Supposedly the last news that came out in the protest is that there is someone who bought it, and it's, I believe, the Caledonian Group, or they and they were going to turn it into a private club. So but I think in some capacity I think that there will be fights, ideally. And if anyone's listening who's really passionate about this kind of stuff, definitely write your representatives and tell them you don't want them to allow that to happen.
Yeah, because that's just what Edinburgh needs, another walled off private space. Great.
Yeah. And also, they're going to have to reformat. I mean, it's a cinema. It's a, like how the amount of energy and effort they're going to have to do to make that a private club. It's pretty gross. But anyway, hopefully the saga will continue, and we'll report on it as much as we can, but no real confirmed news at this moment. Keep writing your representatives, and we'll try to make it back a cinema at some point. So Cinetopia has some big news. We've recently announced it, and I thought I know that Jim, you're a big fan of Bill Forsyth's work, and we've recently announced that we are going to be running a host of outdoor screenings for Local Hero and for the 40th anniversary of Local Hero. So the film actually came out in February, I believe, in the US, and then also in the UK release was the 28th of April. We are actually planning all of our events at the end of May, and that's in part because there's a big King Festival, I hear, that might conflict with said activity, but also it's a little bit better of time for everyone who's involved. The festival is going to be in as classic Cinescapes. So Cinescapes is our outdoor screening strand, is usually around the idea of showing films in places that they were inspired or filmed. And Local Hero is one of those really interesting films because it was filmed in many different parts of Scotland, because there wasn't a perfect spot for what Bill Forsyth, the director, had imagined. He wanted this beautiful beach next to this like idyllic town. And I think the location scouts, if you read Jonathan Melville's book, Local Hero, Making a Scottish Classic, you realize that he found these perfect beaches on the West Coast and this idyllic town on the Northeast coast called Pennon, which is the real town of Furness. So a lot of the exterior shots of the town are in the Northeast of and in a town called Pennon. And all of the beach shots are in Murr and Arisag, which is near Milleg. So it's an interesting way of watching how movie magic happens. But the famous phone box, which is actually not the phone box they use, but it's the one that sits still and working in Pennon, is still in Pennon. And our activity is all going to be in that area, but particularly also in the town of Banff and the town of Portsoy, which the 2016 Whiskey Galore was filmed. But you can find all of that on our website. But I thought this might be a good time for us to kind of chat about, because as we announced it, I found it was really interesting how many people just kind of came out of the woodwork of saying, oh, well, that is my favorite film. And, it was made in 1983, 40 years ago. Why do you think, Jim, this film has sort of been in everyone's hearts for so long, and people still look at it as a great film?
I think there's a few different reasons, but I think I've thought about this a few times. And you look at Bill Forsyth's filmography around this time, right? It kind of covers a proper range of Scottish culture, if you like, right? So you got that sinking feeling in 1979, which is this kind of like capery element with a bit of, there is a bit of edge to it, just in kind of like the terms of the setup and like what's driving the characters there. And then you've got Gregory's Girl, which is a much kind of like, sweeter, low key thing. And then you've got Local Hero, which it's kind of important to remember where Scotland and the UK was at this sort of time, right? And this was, Tory rule, Thatcher, and you've got this backdrop of, the big oil company wanting to kind of destroy this local town. But then you've got this, spoilers for anybody who doesn't see it, but you've kind of got this parallel thing of like they want to take advantage of that, they want a payday as well, and it's these kind of conflicting drivers between kind of like a more romantic notion and a more kind of pragmatic one, and the background that's happening and that. So I think it's a case of it's just a very good film and a very well told story, right? And there's a lot of good character into that to just make it a nice self-contained story. But I think maybe the reason it's endured so much, along with quite a lot of Bill Forsyth's filmography, is it kind of captures to me a bit of where Scotland was in time. It kind of captures a place in the time of the country. without being, but it does it in this kind of slightly more gentle way. It doesn't do it in a social realist way that you would expect of a Ken Loach or, the Dardenne brothers on the continent or something like that. It's a more kind of like hopeful tone than that, I suppose. Like there's melancholy, but it's not grim, right? It's not, I don't think you'd ever look at Local Hero or that Sinking Feeling, Gregory Girl, called them gritty in any way. Like, and I think that to me is what's like quite striking about Bill Forsyth as a filmmaker, particularly this kind of period. So to me, I think that's maybe why it's endured. I think it's first and foremost just a very good film. It's a very well told story with good characters and good performances. But I think it also kind of captures a time and place, and that maybe speaks to why it's been such an enduring presence in terms of cinematic depictions of Scotland, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that I've watched a lot of, I've read the book that Jonathan Melville wrote about the making of, and I've watched a lot of sort of behind the scenes. There's so many behind the scenes making of films, and I mean over the years, because it's so well loved, there's the 25th anniversary and the 30th anniversary and all these kinds of stuff. So it's been quite brought up over and over and over again to talk about. But it was a challenging film for them to fund, in part because it's quite subtle, and it's a comedy, but in a lot of ways, as I think David Putnam, the producer who came up originally with the idea, while Bill directed and wrote the story, the idea was around this sort of Shetland oil boom and how sort of the community of Shetland was able to kind of take advantage of all this North Sea sort of activity. And the way that the film was crafted, given largely because Bill Forsyth was a documentary filmmaker, there has a great deal of authenticity to it in a way that just feels very natural, and that everyone's a nice person in the film. I mean, there's no real bad, evil conflict. I mean, the conflict is obviously whether the town will get sold or not, but it's also just a very subtle comedy, where what David was saying in the David Putnam and the early South Bank shows making of clips I saw was that often in that area you have things like Blazing Saddles, and you had all these like zany comedies going on, and this was a completely different sort of film that came out that was much more subtle, much more like actual life, and this idea of sort of taking your shoes off and taking a moment and sort of, respite from your crazy life, which feels very 80s as well, like the opposite of Wall Street.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, I mean, Michael Douglas really wanted to be in the film, but Bill really felt that Peter Reichert would be the right person for it. But yeah, so the anti-Wall Street, So,
yeah.
But yeah, I think it's it's interesting because it kind of sits. I think maybe the more you watch it, the more you appreciate it as well, or at least that's what's been happening with me. So
Yeah, no, I think I mean, for me, it's I'm a big fan of Bill Forsyth, but I think that for me it is his best film. And I think the idea of doing it, and there's some, I actually kind of like the idea of, once again, I'm not going to be able to make it, of course, annoyingly, but I quite like the idea of watching outdoors kind of in locations inspired it, because, you've got the whole thing going on with the stargazing and all this sort of thing, like the idea of watching it, the idea of watching outdoors in the location that's relevant to actually seems pretty nice to me. So no, it's certainly, I think, it's a film with a lot of rewatch value, but if you haven't seen it before, I think it's actually quite a good place to start with Bill Forsyth. I mean, I think a lot of his films, you could start anywhere with them, but I think Local Hero would be an ideal one to go with. I think it combines a lot of elements of other work to best effect, really.
Yeah. It's a good starting off point, like you said. And then definitely check out Gregory's Girl, which actually is on Mubi right now, and That Sinking Feeling if you're in the UK. I don't know in other countries.
And it's worth checking those out, actually. I mean, not to digress too far from Local Hero, but like That Sinking Feeling has had a bit of a difficult journey to kind of being actually seen in this day and age, because there was a BFI release on I can't remember if it was DVD or Blu-ray, but basically it was a disc release a few years ago where it had the original audio, but for years and years, the only copy of that Sinking Feeling you could get on home media had the original Glaswegian dialogue dubbed out for more comprehensible. It basically sounded like me, I think, right? And I don't think anybody would think I was from Glasgow in the 1970s, but they basically dubbed them in for kind of more understandable Scottish accents, and they could just completely rob the film of like so much doing that. But that was fortunately corrected a few years ago. So I'm assuming that the version that's on Mubi is the original audio. Yeah. So I would certainly check out, because it kind of speaks to kind of like a lot of difficulty in preserving films that are even quite recent, actually. I mean, like if it hadn't had a bit of a fuss made about it, that theoretically could just be lost a few years from now, Yeah. So it kind of highlights the importance of that. So yeah, no, I mean, check out those two films on Mubi. They're great, and yeah, go also, see this in Furness.
That Sinking Feeling, I think was at the time was one of the cheapest feature films like ever made. I mean, I don't know if it was a Guinness Book of World Records sort of thing.
Yeah, it was a budget affair.
So definitely check them out. Our event, we will watch this space, because at the end of this week, we're planning on putting out the tickets, but we have some big announcements coming on who will be joining us. And I'm really excited to tell you who will be coming up and being part of the celebrations, but we'll need those confirmed and announced at the end of the week. But yeah, so this is cinetopia.co.uk/local hero 40th. You can sign up for sort of updates and or all the information that you would like to do. And that is the last weekend of May. So that's the 26th, 27th, and 28th is the public activity happening. And Port Soy, by the way, I just went there last week, and Port Soy and Banff are just amazing towns, which is where most of the outdoor activity is going to be. And we're going to be showing films right by the beach. We're also going to be showing some amazing other films that are Scottish. So more full program coming out later. But one example that I can say is the film Ride the Wave, which is about a surfer from the Isle of Tiree called Ben. He's a big wave surfer, and it was a film that came out a couple of years ago, was really popular. But it's a nice family story as well. And it was showed in Edinburgh. We'll be showing it up right along the beach, right, next door. I think a couple towns over is a big surfing town, Fraserburgh. So those are examples, and we'll announce the full program very shortly. So watch that space, and on to our next film. So the first film we're going to, and I have to say I missed Jim, because I never know what to expect with what I'm getting in terms of your suggestions for films to watch. And we'll really run the gamut here today with new film releases. But the first film we are reviewing, which I saw in the cinema this weekend, was Renfield. And how to describe this film. Jim, take it away.
So the premise here is Renfield, or as his name, as is said multiple times, Matthew Montague Renfield, is the henchman, familiar, I'm not up on my vampire terminology, but basically he is the kind of assistant to Dracula. And Dracula here is played by Nicolas Cage, and I'll come back to kind of like these roles in a second, because there's a slightly odd bit in the intro to the film which is quite interesting, and I've subsequently found out the way the film is pitching itself is actually interesting. But basically those are our two main characters, and the lead is Nicholas Hoult as Renfield, and basically they've been on the run back and forth because they have this pattern of Dracula drinks the blood of a lot of people. The church try and track him down and kill him. They escape, but he's horribly injured, so they need to move somewhere else while Renfield, serves him up people's blood to drink and nurses him back to full power. And when we open the film, basically Renfield is attending a therapy group for people in codependent relationships. Now he's doing this ostensibly to find the partners of the people in the group who are not wanted and deliver them to Dracula, but he kind of starts to realize that he himself is in a codependent relationship with Dracula and starts to want to kind of like branch out on his own with a life where he doesn't have to run all the time. I'll leave it there because we'll get into other parts of it a little bit as well. There's kind of like this slightly odd side plot going along where Aquafina plays a local police officer set in New Orleans who has a personal grudge against the local mafia or the local crime organization. They kind of get wrapped up with Dracula, and it's all a bit weird, to be honest. But that's it, and it's kind of the tone it's going for is clearly comedic, right? It's kind of going for that sort of like horror comedy type thing. It's a very gory film. There's fight scenes, a lot of blood and a lot of guts and gore, but it's clearly going for an amusing tone, right? So I have quite a few thoughts on this one. What would you say is your headline take on this, Amanda?
Premise-wise, this is not my kind of film. Like, let's just start with that. But I mean, I'm not a horror fan, and I'm also not like a gore, obsessed or anything like that. But premise-wise, I thought it was kind of hilarious. This guy needs to go into therapy and whatnot for, a narcissistic boss, and taking advantage of him and whatnot. And, the relationship with the police officer and stuff like that. So, there were parts of the film that I was getting into and kind of just like, this is completely ridiculous, like silly. I didn't find it that funny in a lot of parts. So it lost me oftentimes, and the ridiculousness wore off a bit. At the very beginning too, I was kind of like, what's going on here? I didn't really get it. And so I thought the beginning kind of really was a little off for me. But once I finally got into it, and again, we got into the sort of concept of, the Renfield, the assistant, needing to sort of deal with his narcissistic boss or toxic relationship. I mean, it was silly and funny, but it didn't win awards for me in terms of, hilarity.
Yeah. So I think the concept, right, the setup is quite amusing, right? And I think that, but I mean, frankly, I think that's pretty much clear from the trailer and even the synopsis you could read online, right? It's kind of a funny concept. I'm also very on board with the idea of Nicolas Cage playing this sort of like slightly hammy Dracula. I like that idea. I like that performance. If anything, I think the film needed more of it, to be perfectly honest. In terms of how the film is actually executed, it doesn't really make much of that premise, right? And I wanted to like this more, but it's not really up to much, to be honest. It's one of these films where it works in little moments, right? There are little, like, and in terms of like whether I found it funny or not, I mean, sure, I chuckled from time to time, but it was that kind of like the odd joke, when, lines like, I think Aquafina at one point sort of like says, how are the FBI going to deal with this? Are you going to give them a hard stare across the diner? Like, like little things like that, which made me laugh, right? And I think, in particular in that role, right, even though I find the role a very odd one in this film, Aquafina is an actor I find very funny, right? I think there's just something about the way she delivers her lines, which is really engaging and funny to me. Nicholas Hoult I found less so here, but I think he does all right. The main thing for me though is you'd think with this setup, right, the film would perhaps focus more on character interplay, right? Yeah. Like how people interact with this kind of ridiculous, over-the-top Dracula character, and the therapy group that all talking kind of like therapy, self-help speak. Renfield, who's this 90-odd-year-old guy who looks like he's in his 30s. You'd think it would play more on that, and it doesn't really. It kind of leans into, at points, kind of set pieces based around the action gore. And frankly, those sequences, I don't know what you thought. I thought those sequences were pretty bad, to be honest. I mean, like there's a lot of fight scenes where like the editing is unbearably choppy. I mean, like you really can't make out what is going on at all. And I think that and there's the setup with how Renfield gets his powers and all that. I think there was potential there, right, for kind of getting comedy out of the gory horror, which is kind of another thing you might expect this film to do. But it's just it's made so choppily that it doesn't really work. You can barely tell what's going on, let alone kind of like derive any sort of nervous laughter from it, let's say. So there were bits of it just didn't really work. And the whole kind of like plot with the local crime group, again, it has some good bits and it has some good delivery, right? So you've got Ben Schwartz, who's playing this sort of the son of the matriarch of the crime family, and he's a bit hopeless and over his head and all the rest of it. And again, there's some good comedy from that. Like I've got like Ben Schwartz. Have you ever seen Parks and Recreation? It's not too dissimilar from like if you imagine taking his character there and making him like a hopeless crime kid, it's kind of that, right? And he does that very well. And there's laughs to be had there, but like none of it comes together really. And like you just kind of find yourself like, what, why are we here? And like you wonder whether it's trying to make a point with the constant references to Dracula being a narcissist, right? You do wonder if there's like some sort of like Trumpy undertone here, because like obviously that's how he's referred to quite frequently. But like, is there? I don't know if there is. It doesn't really lean into it. Otherwise, like what, like why lean into that so hard? So I wanted to like this more, and it does have some funny bits. I think it will make for some good internet memes. But as to whether it makes a particularly great film, I have to say, not really. No, I was pretty disappointed with this.
It definitely was a very amusing, like those little bits and sort of again, like you said, the premise. Conceptually, I also agree with you. I think the acting, overall was fine. What didn't work was the film itself as a whole, and all the and the direction, if you were, as you said, the editing, just bringing it all together. So it's like you could have had something there, but it just didn't gel completely together. On that note, I mean, on the note of a film that like is a comedy that mixes genres, that has like fighting and scenes and stuff like that. We discussed Polite Society in the previous, as part of the Glasgow Film Festival. Actually, it was Simon who brought it up. An incredible film come out in terms of being able to mix all these various genres and do something different. That is an exceptional example of a great film that like plays with these genres. This is not. That being said, I agree. In this kind of like a shout out to, hopefully Matchbox Cine Club will bring their Nick Cage-orama film festival, but like it does seem like it would fit in this like very in the canon of Nick Cage films. Like if you're watching a marathon of Nicolas Cage films, this is a great classic Nick Cage performance. So it's definitely with like that kind of fandom, could probably sit down and watch it.
Oh yeah, and I think him playing Dracula is something that kind of made me think, okay, maybe this could be fun, and it delivers on that part of it, right? It really like does, and there's some of his line readings which are, they sound crazy, but it works, right? But I think the thing is, there's not enough of that, right? It needed scenes or a script which showcased that more. And because those are the bits of the film that work, right? And to go, and I haven't seen Polite Society yet, right? But having seen the trailers, the one thing that it kind of reminded me a little of in terms of the way the fights work was, not that I want to inadvertently get into Oscars discussion, Everything Everywhere All at Once. Now, there's a lot going on in that film, as the title might imply. And you might remember when we did it on the show, I was kind of, more mixed on it than people generally were, but it's a good film. And I think the thing is, you could imagine watching that film and thinking, wow, these fight scenes are really good. I'd like to watch one of them again. You are not going to do that with Renfield, right? Yeah. I mean, basically, when there were fight scenes in this film, I just want them to be over with, because there was the occasional kind of like amusing bit of gore that was over the top, but like it would be in like a 2-second cut and then cut. Like you can barely tell what's going on. It didn't really feel like there was a whole lot of choreography to what was going on. It had the feeling of something that they've tried to save in the edit almost. I don't really know what the reason, but so in that sense, I'm surprised that there's that much focus on it, and there are quite a lot of set pieces that are fight scenes, and there is a lot of focus on it, and it's not a long film. I mean, I think it's only about an hour and a half or something, right? So it doesn't have a lot of time to play with, and I feel like it kind of squanders its premise in these like slightly, chopped up, undercooked fight scenes, when I think it has the ingredients there with, you've got a lot of people here who are talented actors, right? And can deliver lines funny and have good comic timing, or just have like this weird, unique delivery, right? You've got a weird, unique delivery as Dracula from Nick Cage. You've got this kind of like stilted English posh mannerisms from Nicholas Hoult. You've got that kind of like brash, funny, quippy stuff coming from Aquafina. Like the thing is, you've got a lot, and then Ben Schwartz doing his, like, there's a lot of potential here for all these kind of like, sure, slightly thinly sketched, but like if you get the interplay between them, that's where the comedy from this film comes, and it's where the parts of it work. The actual kind of like sequences themselves, they don't, and they focus on them a lot, and I think it wastes a lot of time doing that, and it makes it a bit of a damp squib as a result, to be honest.
I wonder, I mean, I've not looked into details of any of these films in terms of production, but I wonder if it's just a budget thing, that they didn't have much budget and they put a lot of money into their cast or whatnot, like not too much into the amount of days that they could film or takes or something like that. But yeah, clearly overall it didn't come together completely for both of us.
No, it's got, I mean, to be honest, I find it had a bit of a weird tone as well. Like, I mean, when it's doing all the stuff about codependent relationships and, finding yourself, like, I could never quite figure out whether it was being sincere or not, like, because it does a whole bunch of stuff with its tongue in its cheek and a kind of ironic nod. And then there's other points where it seems to be like actually being quite sincere about it. And, I think either works, right? I think maybe the former would maybe work better for this film is pitched, but it's just weird. It doesn't quite, that's what it comes down to. I don't think this film actually really knows what it wants to be, and I think it's not focused on the bits that work as a result, right? So I mean, it's not the case of like there's nothing to enjoy here. There is, right? There's good stuff, but it's kind of lost amongst this kind of mishmash of not so great other bits, and they're all kind of like given equal weighting when they probably shouldn't have.
Yeah. Well, definitely not our favorite, but it will, I'm sure, might be worth a laugh if you're a Nick Cage fan at some point in the future. So that is Renfield, out in cinemas right now. All right, so the next film we're going to review is One Fine Morning, Un Bon Matin, a film by Mia Hansen-Love, starring Léa Seydoux. It came out last year at Cannes, won, I think, the Europa Cinema Labels Award Best European Film. It was part of the Directors Fortnight. It stars the amazing, I'm a huge fan of Léa Seydoux, so I was excited to see this film. It takes place in Paris. It's about a widow with a young daughter who is currently going through sort of different parts of her life. One, her father, who was a professor, very intelligent professor who's very well known in Paris, currently has a degenerative disease that is sort of making him lose his sight and his ability to walk and whatnot. As I believe an only child, or no, actually he has two daughters, but as one of the daughters, she consistently goes to visit her father and sort of is dealing with that part of her life. On the other hand, having lost her husband after 5 years, she reconnects with one of her husband's friends, or sort of a mutual friend, and has a love affair with this gentleman who is also married and has a child. And so there's kind of this new, it's a lot of the film is around this love affair and how that sort of blossoms and sort of splits and breaks at some points. It's a film, one of those things where I think we've been talking a lot about different French comedies or whatever. This is a romantic drama. It's not funny. It is a romantic film. And I have to say, I'll ask you, Jim, what you think, but I'll come back and tell you what I think after you.
Yeah, I like this a lot. would be the kind of the headline summary here. I think the thing that struck me from the start of the film, and I think it's kind of a crucial part of it, given the way the story plays out, is this connection between Clément, played by Melville Poupeau, I presume. Apologies to all French people everywhere for my pronunciation. And Sandra, played by Léa Seydoux. And they make that connection fairly on in the film. And I was kind of struck, even from that first scene, about what just kind of like a beautiful, natural, gentle chemistry those two have. And I think obviously part of that will come from their performances, but it's also going to come from Mia Hansen. Is it Love or Lova? I can't remember. I'm going to go with Lova. But it's going to come from her direction as well. And I think that a lot of the film, in terms of then understanding Léa Seydoux's kind of behaviors when we're just focusing on her and it's just her in the shot, comes from understanding the depth of that connection and kind of like what's driving it with other things in her life. And I think that brilliant chemistry that they've got, really honestly, from the very first scene they have together, I think is critical to that. And I think that was the first thing that struck me. So the acting performances here across the board are great, but those two centrally is a big thing. In terms of the rest of it, it's kind of, it's kind of what you would expect from this type of film in terms of the way it sets the tone. But it's just all done extremely well. It's done with this kind of like slightly naturalistic approach to things. And, it's not moments of, it's one of these films where you don't have a lot of moments of high emotion. It's kind of a gradual build of things, and there's an ebb and a flow. And I liked it a lot. And I think to me, the central thing is that relationship between those two. And it really needs good chemistry between those two actors to make that work. And I think they've got that. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other roles around here that bounce off this. There's Sandra's mother, her father, who is suffering from that illness and then goes into the nursing home, and kind of Sandra observing his decline and the effect that has on her, and seeing kind of like how her mother deals with it. There's a lot of other performances backing this up, but I think that central pair is kind of like really what stood out for me. And I think even from that first scene, it really, really stood out how well that was actually done.
Yeah, I will echo that exactly. So I'm a huge fan of French films set in Paris, and I'm a huge fan of romantic films. I mean, like Before Sunset is like one of my favorite films. And I don't think since, a film like that, that's not French, it's, set in Paris, but I've not seen such great chemistry on on screen as I have in this film. I just was blown away by how believable and romantic their connection was. And it was like, it's everything you said. It was also just a beautiful film, like the way it's shot, the way Paris is shot. Like her performance, Leah's performance was incredible. Like you could feel her emotions as, as she was grappling with this, again, this is but yeah, so their love affair, is causing a great consternation in her life, as well as her father's, disease. And it's really, how she's grappling with like something new that's sort of bringing her back to life, and yet something that is really, a huge step in your life that a lot of people go through, and how those things come together at the same time. I will watch this one again, and I will watch this many, many more times. I think I really loved this film, and it brought me back hope for like films, French films or films, or in Paris, because recently I think it was, what was it, I forgot, it was called nonfiction that we watched a couple of years ago or something like that just drove me nuts. And I was starting to think I've like lost my my interest in French films, but when they're done right, and these kinds of films, they're just incredible. And this is an exceptional film.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And I think it's interesting you spoke about kind of like the way Paris is shot, because I think it's particularly, without giving like too much away, it's particularly interesting that I find a bit of a contrast between kind of like how it's shot and then kind of the final scene of the film. which kind of like, you know, it kind of exemplifies kind of the emotional journey that the characters have gone on a little bit, right? In terms of kind of like where they end up and both kind of like how it looks and where they are and things like that. But I think another thing that this film does very well, I think, is the way it handles the father's illness, which is obviously, it's kind of it's a degenerative disease. So he's starting to kind of like lose his awareness and his knowledge, like as things progress, he won't recognize people, and he's not into listening to kind of the same music that he was before. And I think there are a lot. I've seen a lot of films over the past few years which have attempted to deal with this. I think the one that probably broke out into the public consciousness the most is probably The Father, right? The film that Anthony Hopkins unexpectedly won an Oscar for. And I think that's an excellent film, but it did deal with it in a much more dramatic fashion. And then I think the reason for that is it was dealing with it from the perspective of the person who has the disease. But then there's been other films like Viggo Mortensen's directorial debut following that kind of dealt with a similar idea. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the ones where I think it's done it the best, depicting the effect it has on people close to that person, but crucially doing it in a way that's not histrionic and over the top, right? There are no big emotional outbursts. It's just kind of like this slow drip feed of little hurtful moments that kind of like get you down, like where you see somebody not as you know them, or they say something that they wouldn't before, and all the rest of it. And I think a thread that's running through this whole thing is when he goes into the nursing home, they need to deal with his belongings, and there's this whole thing about what they're going to do with his books, right? And there's this lovely, beautiful scene with the daughter where she explains why it's so important, right? Why it's a reflection of her grandfather, Sandra's father. And again, the film has lots of moments like that, which I think, because of the approach it's going for with this, it has those moments to kind of pause, take a moment, and then reflect upon love, grief in this way where you can kind of place it into kind of an actual context of reality, right? It's not just an emotional thing, it's the emotions that you attach to certain scenarios and certain things. And again, when you come back to the central relationship, that's kind of how that works there. And I think why you feel that as keenly as you do, right, is because that chemistry is so good. And because in particular, I would say Lea Seydoux performance is so good. When it has its, peaks and troughs, you feel them and you can actually kind of empathize with them really, really very keenly. So yeah, I mean, if you were to break down any particular individual scene from the film, it's one of these ones where, it's a very kind of like slow burn. There's maybe not necessarily a huge amount of drama in any particular one scene, but it's when you combine it with that chemistry and you combine it with the overall trajectory they're on, you feel it. And I was really very impressed with it. You really do get engaged with this film and the characters like really pretty deeply, I would say.
Yeah, and I go back to the sort of genre where we were talking about other people's children. We also really liked that film. It was part of the Glasgow Film Festival, of a day in the life of from a female perspective, and just a personal family story. And yet I felt like, so in a lot of ways these scenes were not, I mean, everyone had their own sort of personality, but these scenes it's a very talky film, and it's the scenes there wasn't that much drama, and yet I was very captivated by just watching it the whole time. It didn't bore me and didn't stop me. I didn't start looking at, like what like the costumes were fine, and, it was all very natural and, and also beautiful at the same time. But yet just I forgot about all of that stuff and just was very into the story and how these were real people dealing with, real daily kind of things that happens to everybody, not everybody, but, people on their regular life, like, parts of your life. And I think it felt, just universal in some ways. And like you said, I think the performance and everything, the direction of this film did it, it did it for me. I will go back to it many times. I will definitely say it's one of my favorite films I've seen this year.
Yeah, and I think, look, and I don't want to like labor the point, but the performance of that central pair, for me, it really is what makes the film, right? I mean, I will sometimes read or listen to people talking about films, and they'll talk about kind of like chemistry between the leads, and they'll say something like, "Oh, yeah, no, it was really good," and I don't really understand that. Like, I don't see what they're seeing, right? And then I'll see other ones where people say there wasn't, and I'll look at them and I don't know if I agree with that. I honestly don't know how anybody would be able to watch this film and not immediately pick up on it. Like, it's just something about kind of like the blocking, the staging, the body language, even in their first scene together, where it sets it perfectly, and then I think everything after that just serves to re-emphasize it, and that's a very difficult thing to do. You know, I don't want to say that is difficult, right? And I think a lot of this film's emotional depth and power comes from that, because it kind of just sets it for everything after that. So no, I mean, in terms of just the direction of it and the performances, it's really, really very good, and it gives this story the what's the word I'm looking for? It's not the weight. It gives you that window into it where you can then really connect with it pretty deeply. And I was very impressed with it. Really excellent.
I do remember one that we talked about, bad chemistry, and it was with actually Leah Seydoux and Daniel Craig and Bond. So that was like when.
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, I mean, that's probably, but I mean, that's actually not a bad case in point, actually, because I'm pretty sure if I go back, like, I think their chemistry in those films, like, it's fine. I don't think there's anything to write home about. I don't think it was bad, but I mean, like, but I mean, it doesn't. It would actually be quite a good example, right? Because, like, one member of the pair is the same. Honestly, it's like chalk and cheese. It's it's really, really quite different, and it gives you an example of like how it really just deepens everything else in the film if you get that right, and they really do here.
And again, we also had that in comparison to Benicio del Toro and Leah and the French Dispatch as well. That I just remember us talking about.
Oh yeah. This is quite funny. It's obviously CD,
but obviously, it's all the same actor, but good on some capacities and maybe not others. But this one was the hit the home run, as we say. We both agree for once. But yes, this is that is One Fine Morning, and it's out in cinemas at the moment. And please check it out. So the third film we're going to review is RODEO, and Jim, that's coming on the 28th of April, French film as well. Tell us about this film.
So this film centers upon Julia. It's let me start that again. It's a first-time feature from director Lola Kiveron. Again, I've probably got my pronunciation terrible, but it's a feature debut, and it focuses upon Julia, who's a young woman who is very into bike riding, sort of like he's buying these sort of like dirt bikes. And while she's attending kind of a meet where they're all kind of, doing their tricks and their showing off their skills on their bikes, she gets involved with a crew of dirt bike riders who are connected to this garage where basically they, there's a slight criminal element to it, basically. But obviously she's kind of adrift and looking for a kind of place in the world, and she, attaches to that and has to deal with Megan earning her place there, a lot of misogyny flying around from a lot of the otherwise entirely male members of this group. And basically she finds her way by kind of stealing bikes for the owner of this garage who's in prison. And it all kind of like leads up to this kind of like this ideal kind of like job for stealing bikes that she's kind of obsessed about watching videos of. So we're pretty much with Julia for the entire time. I think she's pretty much in every. I think she's in every scene. It's very much focusing on her, played by Julie Ledru, who I think this is the only film she's done, and it's a very impressive performance from her. I have a lot of thoughts about the film itself. The first thing to note is, and I'll be interested to see what your takeaways are in general, Amanda, but the thing that actually stood out to me the most about this film is actually the bike riding scenes. Now we'll come to the other scenes and what I'm maybe implying by saying that elsewhere, but the bike riding scenes I honestly thought were fantastic. And I mean, it seems like a ridiculous thing to say in a film that is called Rodeo and the poster features her on a bike. I wasn't necessarily expecting that. I was expecting kind of the focus to be elsewhere. But in terms of like getting across the fact that she feels alive and happy in that scenario, the two scenes where she steals bikes or when she's riding a bike and kind of like it's not part of some setup, it really gets that across. And I think that, the way that they're shot, but also Julie Ledroux's performance kind of, really works for that. I'm wondering what you thought in terms of those scenes in particular, but also whether there was anything else that did or did not stand out for you.
Yeah, I think what you just said in terms of the way the film was shot was my first takeaway, whether it's the mood that kind of was created within sort of those sort of Saturday night down at the the motorbike sort of group and stuff like that. And I thought it was very beautiful the way it was shot, and also kind of this it's a realist sort of way in filming it as if it could be a documentary, to a certain extent. I liked her the main performance as well. And I thought it was, I was interested in the story the whole time. It was a very personal story, and it, and I think it was something that enlightened me to a world I wouldn't know of otherwise. So I think in that capacity, I liked it. Did you like everything about it? I mean, what do you think?
I mean, yes and no. I think it's a good film. And I like the way the story is approached. Like, I mean, you can see kind of like the school filmmaking comes on. It's got a very sort of Ken Loachy, Dardenne brothers type feel to it. Yeah. What I will say is I think there's a lot more artistry. I mean, artistry is maybe not the right word, but there's a lot more kind of a mythic quality to some of these images, right? In particular when you get towards the conclusion of the film and certain things, like there's a slightly more abstract approach taken than I think either of those filmmakers I've mentioned would do, but you can see it's kind of from that school of tone setting. The only thing I would say is, as good as Julie Ledroux's performance is, it's primarily in those scenes where kind of like she has to emote to something in the moment. I don't think there's a huge amount in the script there. I think that role is pretty thinly drawn in the script, I think, right? I don't think you don't learn a lot about her. And to an extent, I think that's obviously a deliberate choice because you're meant to learn about it in terms of her interactions with other characters. But as a result, I do wonder if, to a certain extent, the setting, these kind of, these folk stealing bikes and, clearly kind of, especially in Julie's case, almost kind of deliberately rejecting belonging somewhere, yet kind of yearning for it at the same time. That setting and then the tone that is kind of achieved with this semi kind of social realist approach. I do sometimes wonder at points in the film whether it was trying to imply a thematic and emotional heft that wasn't actually there in the script. And I think some of the shot choices, they don't necessarily add that either. I mean, they're very good, in particular, as I say, I think a lot of the bike ride, and let's be clear, the bike ride scenes are not kind of like all of the same type, right? There's ones where she's shooting them doing wheelies and tricks at that kind of like meetup. There's another one where she catches up to Julie from behind. There's another one where they follow the road. Like there's a lot of variety there, and they're all very good, right? So I don't want to imply that they're all the same type. They're not, and they're all very good. But outside of that, as good as I think the film looks at points, I don't know if it's quite got the script to match up to it. And it's got elements there where I think it could have lent harder into it, and I think it's got that idea of belonging and kind of that weird conflict between wanting to reject it so you don't get hurt, but also wanting it. And it's got that in the interaction between Julie and this young kid Killian, who's the son of the kind of the head of this group who's in prison, and that connection there and the way that kind of goes back and forth in terms of with her and the child's mother about whether she belongs in that interaction. And I think that there is stuff there, but it feels very thin. It feels very thin. It feels thin in a way that the visuals and the general setup doesn't. So I think it gets very far with that central performance and the general way that the film progresses and looks. But in terms of like the actual, ideas of character to grip onto, I'm not sure there's as much there as you would initially think. And I think that kind of stopped me from connecting to it in the same way that I did One Fine Morning, for instance, that we just spoke about as well, which in some ways, like, there's some similarities there in terms of the realist pitch it's going for, right? But I think it stopped me connecting in that same way as a result.
Yeah, except I think before we started recording, I asked you a couple of questions. I think what you're saying maybe is the same reason why I wasn't as attached to it, but that some of these relationships were left kind of mysterious, or sort of that there wasn't much said, but you could feel, like you said, that this was a woman sort of out of place in this world, in some ways wanting to be kind of accepted into this, hobby, passion, and being in kind of a desperate situation as well, obviously, and then, how that relates to her mom and her relationship with family, and why those are very complicated sort of, difficulties at that age, and, or, over and over and over. So I think it was very much just about that. Like you said, maybe that every scene had the main protagonist in it, and it was just about that, is more than all the other elements. It's definitely a different kind of film, much more mysterious, and kind of the way it was filmed, it was much more mysterious and sort of dark, and, as you said, abstract in certain places that worked well in a social realist way, but slightly more sort of Titanish or something. I don't know, like a little bit more like hyper real, or what do we call it, like surreal in certain parts, versus this like classic social realist sort of filming. But I thought it did a good job in a lot of ways, and it was a very interesting film, and it brought me into kind of a world, like I said, I would have not known about, and I kind of appreciated that experience. And so I do like, and I did like it. But yeah, it wasn't my favorite film, but I did like it. I did enjoy it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a good film. I mean, I can't really point a huge amount of fault to any part of it, and it is an engaging film, and it looks really great. I think it's more just, I think there are those elements that will stop me from. I mean, this sounds harsher than it is, but it's not necessarily a film I'm going to remember in several years. And I think the reason for that is that slight thinness of characters that stops it lingering in your head properly. But in terms of like the actual technical craft as well here, I think it's very good. I think there are a lot of scenes, like I've said, with the bike scenes, which are extremely well shot and really get across the emotion that they're supposed to. Like those scenes in particular are really good emotional visual storytelling, right? And I think it's maybe when you look at the whole package of the storytelling across the whole film, it maybe doesn't work quite as well, but in those individual scenes, it works superbly. So this film has a lot going for it. I think there's just these little bits here and there that stop it from becoming really truly memorable, but there's a lot to like here, and it's definitely worth seeing. And I think, as you say, like having a window into a world that you don't know anything about, dirt biking in my case, I think it also has a lot of value there. It's a good film. It is a good film. I don't want to imply that it's not. It's more just it's not necessary. There's a couple of things where I would like to have felt a little bit more in terms of connection to the characters or understanding motivations a little bit better, just that might have actually just made it linger a little bit longer, I think.
Absolutely. So RODEO is coming out on the 28th of April in cinemas, and it's also probably going to be on Curzon Home as well, correct?
I would imagine so, yeah.
So check it out. And that is our show today, Jim. There's quite a lot of, I mean, we're about to hit, I think the Cannes lineup just hit the other day. Lots of films coming out in the next few months. It's big film season. Looking forward to any in particular?
Oh, not to be that guy, but I mean, I kind of like to look at Wes Anderson's Asteroid City, you know.
I am that gal, so that's fine.
Yeah. So no, I like looking at that. I've already forgotten I mean, I know out of competition, I think you're getting Indiana Jones 5 at Cannes as well, which I'm kind of intrigued by. I want to see whether that's actually going to be any good. But so yeah, no, I think a lot of interesting stuff. But I'll probably be looking a bit below the line there to see what else, because you know how these things work, right? They skin it can, and we actually get them on release in the UK a year later, like we've got with the One Fine Morning. So keep an eye out for because I'm not going to be at the festival because it's insanely expensive and time consuming. So I'll need to wait for it like the rest of the plebs, basically.
Yeah, and Barbie's coming out in a couple months. I'm very excited about that. I mean,
I can't decide what I make of that off the basis of the trailer though. It's you know.
Oh, I think it's going to be fabulous. I mean, I'm a huge Greta Gerwig.
Well, this is the thing that's kind of like keeping me going with this film in terms of my interest levels of it. It's just like, you know, it's not good. Like the fact that it's directed by Greta Gerwig and written by Noah Baumbach as well. Actually, like I think he co-wrote it with her. Like it kind of gives me hope there's going to be a little bit more edge to it, like, you know. So that's, you know, we'll see. Yeah. I am interested in it, and I'm endlessly amused by the fact that I think it comes out on the same day as Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer.
Right. Yeah.
Choose your fighter, you know.
Yeah, I'll be at Barbie for sure. Yeah, so huge films coming out in a couple months. We'll review as many as we can. And Local Hero making its release into cinemas next month, and also our event at the end of May to check out. So again, Cinetopia.co.uk/Local Hero 40th, and we'll be back next month with more reviews and interviews. So see you then.